Hello students, I hope you all are doing well. Welcome to the Recitals in-depth by Vajiram Ravi. Here we will be covering the month of May 2024's economy and infrastructural current affairs topics in detail. The broader themes that we are going to cover today are as follows: Indian agriculture, money and banking, public finance, investment and infrastructure, and social development. So let's get started. So students, welcome to the economy and infrastructural portion of your recitals for the month of May. So here we will be discussing all of the important articles that have come in the recitals in the month of May in great detail. Now here I want all of you to have a glimpse at the very topics that we are going to discuss today. So there will be around 25 topics that we are going to discuss, and a suggestion from my side would be to open your recitals and also to watch the video together to get a greater understanding of all the important topics here. Now, starting with the very first article, we find that recently the government of India has increased the capacity of hydropower projects in the country by 4 additional gigawatts. And this is a very important step in securing India's energy security imperatives. Now, before that, we want to discuss about some of the key concepts when we talk about the electricity scenario in the country. As we can look into this particular figure here, we find that most of India's energy is actually derived from the source of coal. Around 50% of the total installed power capacity in the country as on March 2024 is coming from around coal, right? If we consider the next major component from where India actually derives its power from is a very important, crucial renewable energy, the solar energy. Right. Apart from that, we find that we also use a diversity of other energy resources such as wind energy, nuclear energy, small hydro, and also hydropower projects. If you look at the total distribution of the central, state, and the private sectors in the total installed power capacity, we find that the most of the power that is generated in the country is coming from the private sector, or around at 220 gigawatts. And this is, we are talking about the installed capacity. Right. The second biggest sector is actually the state sector. It is not the central sector, let me tell you. And finally, at the third largest, say, component of India's power sector, it is actually the central sector power. Right. So you can easily understand this is coming from the private sector companies, from the state-owned companies, from the various states of India, and finally the central government also. So we find that this is the entire scenario as of now. But recently, as of 2024, right, as we compare with the power that has been generated from the last financial year, that is from 2023-2024, we find there has been some trends which have been arising. Firstly, the most important aspect that we have to understand, that the renewable energy, right, renewable energy component has increased by around more than 10% in the last financial year. Right. So the main component of renewable energy that we want to aggressively also promote as a country which is going towards sustainable power sources. So we find that the government over a period of 1 year, it has increased the renewable energy by around 10%, or around, to be exact, increased by around 4 gigawatts of power. But there are various issues with this renewable energy. Firstly, the main issue is the amount of variability. Right? That means the renewable energy sources like solar energy, the wind energy, they're actually having higher amount of variability. That means depending on the amount of sunlight, depending on the amount of wind, say potential places in the country, always we do not find a constant amount of supply when we talk about the renewable energy. And that is why this is one of the reasons why India is actually relying more on coal energy, because we have to understand, we easily get a supply of coal, and this is not dependent on the vagaries of, say, day and night, or say the mountain regions, or say the coastal regions, right? So that is why India as a country is dependent, it is one of the reasons why, on coal energy majorly. Right? One of the main things that you have to consider in renewable energy also is the element of cost involved, right? So also when we talk about the high amount of cost to set up renewable energy, such as building a large amount of solar parks, right? Manufacturing of solar panels within the country. So this involves a lot of costs, and also we find that China is dominating the manufacturing of domestic solar cells in the country, right? And we are dependent on China for this reason. Next, we have to understand that when we talk about renewable energy, we are also understanding that it is not as of now, if we compare, right? It is not fully capable to meet India's total energy requirements. And when we talk about the total energy requirement, we have to obviously talk about India's peak power demand, right? Now, when we talk about India's peak power demand, we understand that the Ministry of Power in the country has set a target of achieving 242 gigawatts of energy from all of the sources in the last financial year, that is financial year 2023 to 2024. That just concluded in the month of April, right? Now we have to understand that this is a total energy, the target that has been set by the Ministry of Power. But the thing is that here we have to understand, in this total target, right, we have already demanded around 244 gigawatts, and out of the total installed capacity in the last financial year, we were able to meet only around 240 gigawatts, right? So we have a deficit of around 1.4%, right, when we talk about the total power demand. Right now, when we talk about the peak power demand, it is the total amount of energy that is demanded by the various sections of the population across the various areas of the country. And here, the main reason why the peak power demand is increasing over a period of time, right? One of the main reasons is attributed to the increasing amount of population of the country, due to which we require a lot of economic activities, right? Now, the second reason is actually climatic in nature. When we talk about climatic reasons, also right now we are witnessing, right, steady amount of heat waves in the country, which is increasing over a period of time. Earlier, say around 5 to 10 years back, heat waves used to be a very common phenomenon in the country, but mainly constrained around the northern belt of the country. Right now, what we are seeing is the prevalence of heat wave uniformly all across the country due to the effect of global warming. And that is why, due to increasing temperatures, people are right now using more and more air conditioners, more and more refrigerations, especially during the month of summers. The offices, the industries, the household sectors, their energy demand has increased over a period of time, and this has led to increased amount of peak power demand. And that is why India is also seeing a shortfall of around say 2 to 4 gigawatts of energy. And that is where the hydro energy is coming into picture. That is why recently, as of now, the various stakeholders in the government, the government authorities, are trying to increase or say fulfill this deficit via hydropower, right? And this is what we are going to focus from here on. Now, when we are talking about a particular report, right, it is very, very important for us to understand the trends of electricity according to the Global Electricity Review of 2024. Now, this is actually released by Ember, which is a private think tank, and the reports, or say the data that you are seeing here, is actually taken from the original reports here. And this is a very exhaustive say trends of the energy demand in India, as we can see here. If you talk about the Indian power sector status in 2023 and compare India with Asia, world and other economies, we find that actually the carbon intensity, or say the amount of carbon dioxide generated per kilowatt hour, we find that India is actually somewhere greater than the world, or say the number of say carbon intensity or the carbon dioxide produced, or say the greenhouse gases produced per capita is actually more, right, according to the kilowatt hour. Now, when we talk about demand per capita, or say the demand of electricity per person in India, Asia and the rest of the world, we find that India is actually very at the lower end of the spectrum. That means we have to understand that when we talk about per capita demand of power, India is actually less than the world, right? That means the world is actually using more power per people, right, or say more electricity per people, and India is actually using less than that. Also, when we talk about the emissions per capita or greenhouse gases emitted per individual in the world in India, we find India is again at the lower levels of the world. Now, these two things are reflecting that Indians, while they are actually increasing the demand for power, right? But actually, when we talk about per capita, the rest of the world is actually more polluting than India, more demanding in power than India, right? Now, when we talk about another data from here, we find that the emissions of the top electricity consumers in 2023, and when we talk about ranking, we find that emissions intensity, as we have seen in the very first trend here according to that, India is at the top. That means the total energy that is demanded by the country is actually topped by China, Japan, and the rest of the world, right? But when we compare emissions per capita, that is per individual, India is far below. It is at 1, right? That means Indians are actually less polluting in nature, less demanding in nature when it comes to power. But we see, according to the total intensity, it will be obviously be higher because we are home to 1.4 billion people. That is why we find this difference. When we talk about per capita, India is far low. And when we look at another graphs, another data here, we find that changes in electricity generation in 2023 in India, we find that India is actually promoting more and more of hydropower, solar power, and also wind power, right? We have to understand, obviously, the demand for coal in India has obviously increased because coal is a particular energy resource where our thermal power plants are, say, easier to produce electricity with. But we have to also understand, over a period of time, these three components are also increasing, right? So this is also a very, very interesting and a positive trend. Now, when we look about the India total electricity mix, we find that in the previous slide, we have seen the total installed capacity, right? Now, out of the total installed capacity, more than 70% of the power is actually coming from the coal, right? Then it is coming from, say, hydropower. Then it is coming from the solar power. So we find that despite the installed capacity, right, we find that the actual energy generation is actually done by coal sector. But we have to also find another positive development where India is right now the third largest solar energy generator. Or we find that India is actually just after China and the US at rank 3rd. It has just surpassed Japan in this particular ranking. So we find that through this particular data, which is actually released by say AMCA, right? So this is actually the trends that we have to understand. Now, we have seen that the recent initiatives by the government of India is to mainly increase the power generation, and a majority of the power is actually coming from the hydropower, as reflected in the various news and current affairs in the in the recent times, that recently the government of India is actually thinking of harnessing the hydropower generation in the country. We remember that we have actually fallen on deficit according to the last financial year. So that is why the government right now is focused heavily on investing a lot on hydropower, especially on the northeastern region, and especially on the account that recently IMD has suggested and also predicted an above normal monsoon. And we find that when we talk about hydropower is actually dependent on the rivers and also on the amount of monsoon at a particular period of time, right? So that is why we find that recently the government is actually tapping into Arunachal Pradesh and Himachal Pradesh and various other hilly regions when it comes to their power requirement. And also recently we find that India's hydropower capacity will be increasing from around, say, 42 gigawatts, right, to 67 gigawatts by 2031-2032. Now, these are the very important value additions which you have to definitely quote in your mains answers, right? So this is India's target, right, to increase hydropower to around 67 gigawatts by 2031 to actually diversify India's energy requirements. Now, also we find that India is not only focusing on domestic, say, hydropower initiatives. While domestic hydropower initiatives means building more dams, or improving the infrastructure of existing dams, or say hydropower projects, building more and more small and regional hydropower projects in various forested areas, in various hilly areas of the country. It is also not focusing on that. It is also focusing on, say, the various collaboration with countries in the neighborhood, such as with Nepal, such as with Bhutan, right? We find that the Indian government has recently helped Nepal in the construction of their Arun 3 project in Nepal, right? It is actually a very, very important hydropower project which is having a capacity of more than 900 megawatts. When we come to Arunachal Pradesh, it is actually partnering with Bhutan to also formulate the Dibang multi-purpose hydropower. So we find that India is not only collaborating within the domestic regions of the country but also internationally. And when we talk about the global ranking of hydropower generation in the country, we find that India is at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6th place when it comes to generation of electricity by hydropower. Now it is actually very less. That is why we have to understand that India wants to increase this over a period of time. And also when we look at the total potential of the various river capacities or say river basins in India, we find that Brahmaputra region, Brahmaputra river is actually having the highest amount of potential when it comes to the capacity is to be taken under construction, because we find that Brahmaputra is, or say the river flows through hilly region, and hilly region or the topography of the hills give a very good conduit for the rivers and also for the dams to be constructed. Apart from that, we also see that the east flowing rivers, the west flowing rivers, they also have a large amount of capacity under operation, right? And also when we look at Ganga, right, we also have many new projects which are taking place over the river Ganga and also over Indus. So these are the various important highlights and the trends that you need to understand when we talk about this particular hydropower imperative of the country as of now. Now, there is a question. This is a UPSC practice question, a prelims question, where I want all of you to answer this and let me know in the comment what is the answer of the same. And over a period of say various topics, I will be giving you questions in almost every topic for better practice of your say completion of these topics. Right? So that is why I want all of you to participate in the YouTube comment section to actually help me understand what is the answer and what is the level of your understanding. So have a look at this question. If you want, you can pause the screen and answer accordingly in the comment section. Now, according to recent data, we find that the amount of exports and imports in the Indian agricultural scenario has fluctuated over a period of time. Mainly we find that there has been increased amount of say imports and also decreased amount of exports from India, and here we'll be understanding the causes and the reasons of the same. Now we find that over a period of time, when we look at the data here, there are very important observations here when we talk about India's total agricultural trade. Now we start from the years of 2012 and up to 2023-24 financial year. We find that while the exports have say almost always been above imports in agricultural sector, but when we look at the last two financial years, right, and even extend to the last 3 financial years, we find that the exports have actually decreased over a period of time. It started at say $50 billion, increased to a little to around say $53 billion, and it has decreased to below 2021 levels as of now. It is at $48.8 billion, and such figures specifically of the current financial year's figures are very important for your mains answers. So you can easily quote in your answers what is the actual level of agricultural trade in the country. Right? Now here we find that when we talk about say the import figure, right, the import figure, as I told already, it has always been kind of lower than the export values. Now we see that over a period of time from 2021, or say even if we talk about 2020, 21, 22, 23, 2020 was a COVID year, right? And we find just after the COVID pandemic, we find that the agricultural imports have say increased over a period of time. Then also we find in the next year it has increased, and finally if we find in this particular year it has actually moderated or say decreased by around $3 billion. Now if we look at the last financial year, over the last financial years, right, both exports and imports have reduced. Right? Now there are some crucial observations from the same. Now before going to the other kind of observations, we have to also look at the recent FAO, Food and Agricultural Organization's food price index. As of recent times, as we see that globally, when we talk about the global food say market, the prices of food say in recent financial years, right, say from 2020 to 24, or say 2021, it was a COVID pandemic year, right, to right now 2024, the prices or the overall global prices of agricultural commodities, they have decreased, right? So we find that while the prices all across the world when it comes to agri commodities are decreasing, right, we find that the exports of the country has decreased imports have also decreased, right? So here we find some crucial trends. Firstly, we have seen that there is a both say double decrease in both exports and also imports of agri commodities, right? Now, the second observation is that while the FAO food price index is telling that recently the food prices are moderated, right? FAO index is telling that the food prices have decreased over a period of time, right? And this is why we can actually tell that maybe this is making the Indian agricultural crops less competitive. And when we talk about less competitive, we obviously mean that, for example, consider the case of Indian production of rice, right? Now, for example, on a usual day, the rice is priced as, for example, 100 rupees per kilo. But over a period of time, say definitely after COVID pandemic, right, after the shutdowns and all the lockdowns were lifted by the respective governments across the world, we find that the production and the distribution, transportation, marketing of the various agricultural commodities improved over a period of time. If you see, right now what is the value of the total global prices of agriculture, we find that is the same value as it's persisted in the 2015 and 2010 onwards, right? We find that, for example, in 2024, the prices of Indian rice is around at 100 rupees. Now, due to the decrease in the global prices of agricultural commodities, maybe the global price of rice is just at rupees 80, right? So, obviously, the prices have decreased globally. So, what will the global or say the world demand? More of Indian rice or say rice produced by some other countries such as Vietnam or say China. Obviously, they will be demanding the commodities which are priced less. So that is what we have to understand. The Indian say export market of agricultural goods have become less competitive due to the globally decreasing price of the agricultural commodities. And this is a very, very important fact that we have to understand. Next, when we talk about the other important global events, right, we have understood one of the global events we discussed is the COVID pandemic, right, is the COVID-19. The other global incidents which are happening all around the world, such as the conflicts which are taking place in Russia and Ukraine, in Israel and Palestine, in Central Asia, in Azerbaijan and so on, these are also the events which are disrupting the world trade. And also over subsequent slides, we'll be seeing that how that impacts have actually been seen in the Indian agricultural say export and import trends. Now, if we start with the if we start with the key trends of agri exports, we find that recently what the government has done is actually imposing a lot of bans on various agricultural commodities from the country. The very first commodity that we can find is that if we look at the total top agricultural items from India, we find that over a period of time, right, the marine products from the last financial year, they have decreased in value. The non-basmati rice component, they have also decreased when we talk about Indian exports, right? When we talk about sugar, it has also decreased drastically, right? When we talk about basmati rice, it has increased marginally. Spices, they have also say marginally remained kind of stagnant or actually say increased, right? When it comes to buffalo meat, raw cotton and so on, we observe these kind of trends, right? So the main items that we have to consider here is actually the items of sugar, rice, right, and also some other commodities. Now when we talk about sugar, right, India has right now tightened the sugar exports or say restricted the amount of sugar exports that should be from the country, because we find that the domestic production of sugar has actually been impacted due to various climatic events and also due to fears of inflation, right? So domestic production and the inflation fears have actually warned the government to actually impose some stock limits within the country when it comes to sugar. And that is why India has now actually a ban on the sugar commodity. Next, when we talk about the rice, right, India has banned export of non-basmati white rice, right? And here, because also the same reasons we have to understand that India right now wants to curb inflation, particularly in the food items. Because as of now, even when we are talking as of now, according to April figures, According to April figures, the food inflation in the country is actually more than 7% when we talk about the consumer price index. And a major part of this inflation is actually led by rice, pulses and other commodities apart from sugar, onion and so on. Right? So that is why we have to understand combating inflation is a very, very important task. Right? And that is what we have to also understand. India has extended, apart from the non-basmati white rice export restrictions, the same restrictions, right, have been modified and also been extended on the parboiled rice. Right? And there has been a total amount of 20% export duty. So exporters need to pay 20% more to export their rice when it comes to parboiled rice. And finally, we have to also understand, right now, onions are also on the restricted lists. And the main reason is obviously due to inflation and domestic production constraints. Right? Now, we have to understand that these kind of export restrictions, right, when we understand the context of world trade, we have the WTO, the World Trade Organization. Now, the World Trade Organization never wants any restrictions in any kind of export or import from any of the countries, because WTO wants to promote a free and fair world trade. And that is where we have to understand WTO has actually spoken against these various bans restricted by India. Right? When we talk about the wheat exports, when we talk about the rice exports, right? So there have been many restrictions by India. And this is actually a very, very contentious issue at the World Trade Organization. And also, when we talk about, say, the Act of India giving aid to various neighboring countries, India did not let these export restrictions come in the way of giving aid to the rest of the nations, such as in the case of Maldives. Even when, right now, India is having a diplomatic issue with Maldives, but we find that India has recently exported rice, wheat, sugar to Maldives also. So it is not always this case that India's export restrictions are always followed, right, in a strict manner. It is also followed when the rest of the countries need aid. Now, when we talk about aid, we have to also talk about Afghanistan. When the Taliban actually took over Afghanistan, India is still now supplying wheat, a lot of supplies of wheat to the Afghani people. So we find that export restrictions are not impacting those kind of activities. But yes, according to WTO, right, it is a very, very serious infringement of the world, fair trade rules and regulations. And because there have been many restrictions here, as we can see here, we can find that non-basmati rice, sugar, basmati rice and so on, they have decreased in value. And this is why we have to understand the overall values of export from India has also decreased. Now, when we talk about the trends in imports, we have to talk about two important agricultural commodities. Firstly, the edible oils, right? And second, the pulses. When we talk about edible oil, right, we have to understand that over a particular period of time, India is actually dependent on the import of edible oils from the rest of the world. Correct? Now, when we talk about India's edible oil imports, we find that it has kind of dependent on the rest of the nation, rest of the world for this particular aspect. Now, also when we talk about the volume of, say, the import of vegetable oil, we find that apart from March and April, we find there has been, say, an increase in, say, the agricultural imports of edible oils. So we find that overall the agricultural imports in India has actually decreased, but we find that the edible oil import bill has increased over a period of time, because simply India does not have enough domestic production of edible oils in the country, be it mustard, soybean and so on, right, particularly the palm oil. India is not having that amount of, say, domestic production in proportion to the domestic demand. Next, when we talk about the pulses, we find that over a period of time, right, while the production of pulses have kind of stagnated, and also in the recent period of time, right, they have decreased, but the imports over a period of time, they have been increasing, while over just, say, 1 year gap, there has been some fluctuations. But we find India is heavily dependent on tur, masoor, urad kind of pulses from the rest of the world. And this is also why we have to understand these two things, right? Edible oil and pulses, they are increasing the import bill of the country. And here when we talk about some of the key takeaways from the entire discussion here, we have to understand that firstly, it is the farmers, right, who are being impacted. Why? Because we find that the exports of various commodities such as rice, say sugar, and say the onions and the various other commodities, they have been restricted. And we find that farmers who export their goods or say crops to the rest of the world, they get remunerative pricing. But if they are being restricted in this manner, their incomes will be impacted. And that is why we have to understand a rules-based policy. A rules-based policy must be, say, in place, where the bans and the restrictions must be temporary in nature. Because of at the end of the day, farmers' incomes are being affected. While we have this mission of achieving double the farmers' income by 2022 initially, right? We have to understand that the domestic policy imperative for the farmers is to increase the farmers' incomes by twice the amount. But we find that these export bans and restrictions combined with the food and agricultural organizations, say, price index of agriculture, right? We find that the global prices are decreasing. While in India, we are having export bans. So there must be a rules-based policy where the domestic crops of rice, wheat and so on, wherever we have the restrictions, they must be having a temporary period, and also they must be well calibrated with inflation imperatives also. And this is where we have to understand India must be increasing the production. India must be increasing the production of particularly crops such as these crops where we have export bans, right, across the country to actually allay these inflation fears. And also we have to understand India has to increase the production of the crops which they are actually dependent on imports, such as pulses, such as oilseeds, right? And for this, India has also a very, very important mission on oil palm, mission. And here, this is having an outlay of around 11,000 crores over a 5-year period, right? And it is actually giving a price assurance to farmers who are actually growing the palm oil, right, cultivation. And the target is to reach around 10 lakh hectares by 2025 and 18 lakhs by 2030. And here, the main areas where the National Oil Palm Mission will be targeted is at northeastern regions and the island regions, because the palm oil is actually grown in areas which are favorable to evergreen forested regions. And this is where we have to understand the main issue of the entire, say, agri-import imbalance and say the decrease in the recent trends is relying on the domestic production, increasing amount of domestic production, which will be also making India self-reliant or Atmanirbhar, right? So India, from the COVID pandemic times only, the very policy imperative of the country has been achieving self-reliance, that is Atmanirbharta. And that is what India must be also doing the same. Particularly, the same thing must be also done with the pulses, right? And for this also we have to understand, when we are coming to the issue of the pulses, we find that the government has actually a policy named as the minimum support price. And we know that under minimum support prices, we have 23 various crops. And within the same, we also have pulses, right? And on the other hand, we are also dependent on import of pulses from the rest of the world. And we have seen, according to this FAO report, the global prices of the agricultural commodities are falling down. So also we find that the pulses which are imported, right, from the rest of the world, their prices are also coming down. Now we have to understand that there is a dissonance between the rest of the world prices of pulses and the domestic prices of the pulses. Now this is where we have to understand the minimum support price regime or the MSP regime has to be made more compliant with the international prices, right? So with the international prices also, the convergence of MSP must be there, right? Because MSP is actually a policy where the government of India is trying to promote a minimum amount of price floor for the farmers, right? Now what happens if the value of this import of, say, prices of pulses has actually gone below the price floor, right? Now where will be the farmers going? So that is where we have to understand. In India also we find that the implementation of MSP is not uniform across the country. It is mainly some states such as Chhattisgarh, Punjab, Haryana, they have implemented MSP quite well. But what happens to the farmers who do not take the benefit of MSP due to, say, lack of awareness, lack of implementation? They have to sell at the market prices, right? They have to sell at the market prices. But in the market prices, we are seeing prices are low. So they have to sell the prices, they have to sell the pulses at lower market prices. And this is what we have to understand. The MSP will be failing in this kind of a system. This kind of system which is actually integrated with the global economy. It is not a bad thing. Integration with the global economy is a good thing, but the domestic policies of MSP must be made resilient with reference to the international prices, and also the implementation of MSP should be promoted in this manner. And in this manner, finally, there is one more final consideration. We have to promote more and more crop diversification in this manner. Right? We find that across the nation we are having the shortfall of various crops, and the lack of production of onions, for example, horticultural items, or say tomatoes, or say the sugar plantations. So they must be promoted in a manner that must be supporting the government initiatives and also environmental applications of crop diversification, right? So actually, say, increase firstly the supply of agricultural commodities to the markets. Secondly, the main aspiration of the country is to give income and source of, say, production to the rest of the people. And thirdly, it is also about protecting the soil fertility and also the environmental integrity of the country too. So these are all the things that are important in the article. I know it has been a very deliberative one, but please be assured that all of these points, if you quote in your mains answers, we will definitely getting more than half to 1 marks even extra in your mains answers. Right? Now, I have this question for you all to answer in the comment section and let me know what is the answer here. The Securities Exchanges Board of India recently has curbed the practice of front running, which is a kind of a nefarious practice in the stock market. It's a very naughty practice. Now, to understand this naughty practice, we have to take the example of a very infamous scandal which took place in Axis Bank Mutual Fund, or these are actually also known as asset management companies. We understand that mutual fund companies actually manage the various assets of the various people. Right? And this is actually one of the mutual funds in the country, and recently we also see it, we have actually witnessed the case in this particular manner. Now, in this particular AMC, Asset Management Company, Axis Mutual Fund, right, we had one individual, Viresh Joshi. Now, Viresh Joshi was actually a top, say, official within this mutual fund. Now, he had access of a particular news that Axis AMC is actually going to invest in, for example, X, Y, and Z stocks in the Indian stock market. And obviously, mutual funds companies, they invest regularly in the stock markets, and the information of this is actually available with the top officials, obviously, because they're working within them, and he is also a fund manager. So he is having access to something which we know as unpublished price sensitive information. That means now the information of this AMC is with him only, right? Because it is an internal company decision to actually invest in XYZ stocks. It has not invested yet. And now let me tell you, whenever mutual fund companies or big companies such as insurance companies, even the LIC of it, when they try to invest in stock markets, they generally do in huge volumes, right? And when we understand that the prices of the stocks, they typically depend on the market forces of demand and supply. Similarly, when we understand when the demand of a particular stock is very high, we find that the prices will be definitely increasing because the supply is not enough, right? When the demand and supply is kind of equal, the prices remain kind of same. And when the supply of the stocks are actually greater, the demand is actually less, and so the prices actually fall. So this is how demand and supply in the stock markets also operate. Right? But we have to understand in this particular case, when Viresh Joshi is having access of internal information that XYZ companies would be invested in by Axis AMC, now he will be becoming very happy, because right now what he will be immediately doing is actually buying the stocks of XYZ. Because once after Axis invests in these XYZs, right, the market prices of these stocks will be immediately increasing, because mutual fund companies, they purchase stocks in huge amounts. That is why the prices increase, right? Because the demand increases with the supply of the stocks in the market. So that is why after getting this information, he becomes very happy. He immediately starts investing in these stocks before even Axis invests in, and he does not stop here. What he does is actually passing this information of this particular stocks investment decision of Axis to his friends, to his best friends. Now his best friends can be, say, his friends, his family members, his, say, for example, say a favorite friend in Axis only, maybe the employees, right? So these friends will be informed of this decision by Axis before and only, and they will also do what? They will also invest in this stock, right? Now this particular activity of investing in the stocks of XYZ by Viresh Joshi and his friends take place before actually Axis actually invests publicly. Right? Now already what has happened, once he got the information, he invested. Once he passed the information to his friends, they also invested. Now the prices, as we can understand, has increased before even Axis has invested in the stocks. Right? The prices of the stocks have already increased. Now once after these activities, when Axis will enter the market, the prices will increase by super margins. Finally, who will be gaining here? Finally, Viresh Joshi and his friends, they will be only gaining in the market. Finally, when Axis will be actually investing in XYZ stocks, right, they will be actually gaining a lot of money. And finally, we have to understand retail investors, they will be losing out, because they did not have this advantage of this unpublished prices information earlier, right? Had they known, they would have also invested. Right? But right now the prices of the stocks has increased by a super margin, right? And now when the prices have increased, what do you think they will be doing right now? They will be selling the stock, right? They will be selling their stocks, and we have to understand, when they are selling their stocks, they will be increasing the supply of the stocks in the market, and the prices will be falling. Finally, the retail investors, and even in the Axis company, right, they will losing money. So finally, the retail investors, they will be losing money at the end of the day, right? So this is what front running is. It starts with price information, or say internal news of a company reaching the ears of, say, one employee, and that employee passing the news to their friends, and collectively these two together, they start investing in these particular stocks. And when they invest, the prices of the stocks go up, because they also invest a lot of money. And when the prices go up, after this, the formally Axis is actually investing in this same, and in the entire thing Axis is not being aware of this kind of scam which is taking place, right? Now when Axis invested, the prices increased by super margins, and finally when the prices increased by super margins, he and his friends sold off, having huge amount of profits. After selling off, the prices declined, and when the prices declined, the retail investors lost a lot of money in the stock market. This is how actually front running takes place in the stock markets. And here, when we talk about the recent SEBI norms, SEBI obviously does not want this kind of unfair trade practices. This is also one form of insider trading. Insider trading means that if you are an insider of a company and you know the decisions of what that company is going to do in the stock market, you have a first-hand advantage of actually moving in the stock markets. So this is where SEBI has came in to stop this kind of insider tradings, stop this kind of front running, right? And here there are some institutional mechanisms where SEBI has imposed in here. Firstly, SEBI will be increasing the surveillance, right? Surveillance in this particular manner using technology, data analytics to curb any unfair, malicious practice in this manner. Right? SEBI will be investing in technologies to track the prices of the stock movements. If they find some typical variation in the stock market prices, so the Axis and, say, the various regulators, they will be immediately informed of these changes. Next, there will be internal controls within the company according to SEBI, strict procedures preventing employees, dealers from engaging in misconduct, right? Then also the process should be escalated to particular authorities, investigating bodies for any kind of violations, and also increased amount of accountabilities should be maintained, particularly to the stakeholders. The stakeholders here are particularly the asset management companies at the very end. So whatever the decisions they are doing, they must not be disclosing the decisions particularly to their employees, and even if they are doing so, the employees must be having a particular code of conduct. Then the second stakeholder is obviously the employees, and employees are generally the top management in this manner, right? Next, there are other kind of stakeholders such as the connected entities. Connected entities are the best friends of Videsh Joshi, as we have seen here, right? The best friends means the, say for example, family members, friends, or say other stock brokers also. So Videsh can also have some other friends in the market, so they can also do the same. And finally, what we have to understand is the retail investors, right? So we have to understand, we have to curb these two kind of people, right, who actually involve deliberately in the stock markets by increasing the prices by super margins, and when the prices increase, they just sell off the stocks. And also whistleblowing mechanism should be also promoted. That means if a particular employee found out that Videsh is actually doing this kind of things, so they can actually report the same to SEBI or say the higher management of the company. So whistle blower should be also be promoted in this manner. And finally, we have this question. Please do solve this and let me know in the comment section what is the answer for this. Recently, Indian stock markets have seen an increasing amount of participatory notes. And what is the same? We have to understand this in great details. Now, when we understand that in India, we have the stock markets, right? And there are many people who can actually invest in the stock markets. Now consider there is an foreign portfolio investor, right? Now this foreign portfolio investor maybe is resident in the United States and he is registered with SEBI in India, and after registration only he can invest his money in the Indian stock markets, right? So this is how FPI is actually investing in the stock markets in a very simple way. But we have to understand, if any other US individual who is not registered with SEBI, can they invest in the Indian stock markets? By convention, we obviously understand that they cannot. But through participatory notes or P notes in brief, they can. How? Because this particular individual can contact the FPI, who is also based in the US, right? Now, on his behalf, this foreign portfolio investor will be investing in the stock market under his own name, right? The investor here, let us call him investor B, right, and him A, right? Now B's identity will not be known to the SEBI. B's identity is known only to A here. And here the main aspect of the investing in the stock markets in India from the US without even registering with SEBI is actually the main advantage of these P notes. That is, it is actually very simple for people who are not registered with SEBI abroad to invest in the Indian markets directly, right? So we find that this is the process where these P notes are actually issued. Who issue the P notes? The FPI investors, they issue the P notes to the other investors who are not listed or say registered with SEBI. But here all the important data with reference to the number of P notes issued, right, has to be say delivered to the SEBI by investor A, who is an registered FPI in the country, every quarter. Right? The names and other details are not say important, but the number of P notes and say the amounts, everything has to be disclosed to the SEBI. The names are not disclosed. Okay, so this is a very important and a very interesting way of how others can invest in Indian stock markets. So this is a simple way which is operate, and this is also known as foreign, right, offshore derivatives. These P notes are actually one of the foreign offshore derivatives. Now foreign offshore derivatives generally mean, obviously these are actually based on foreign. For example, from this investor's perspective, he is investing in Indian stock markets. So this is actually a particular exchange which is taking place in foreign markets. And offshore, obviously, because it is not taking place in this particular manner, where the domestic stock markets are not involved, but the international stock markets are involved. And derivatives, why? Because this individual is not directly investing in Indian stock markets. It is actually going via this FPI. And that is why it is actually deriving the stocks, say, from A. Right? So that is why we name it as a derivative, or derivative is any stock market instrument which is actually having the value from any other underlying asset, commodity or such otherwise in the stock markets. Right? So recently we find there is an increase in P notes to the tune of around 1.5 lakh crore. So the main advantage of P notes as to why these individuals are actually investing in this manner. Firstly, it is actually saving time. Right? It is actually saving time of the investors, as we can find that investor B contacted investor A, who is actually registered with SEBI, to invest in the stock markets. So if investor B want to directly invest in the stock markets, investor B has to go through various rules, regulations, registration norms and stringent controls of the SEBI. So that is why it saves his time to invest in this manner. Right? So it is saving the time in this manner. Next, we have to understand that the big advantage here is actually the anonymity here. Anonymity means that SEBI would not be knowing the names or the identity of the P note holder. Right? So this is also a very plus point for the investors, some kind of investors, particularly hedge funds who do not want say a particular amount of identities disclosed, right, to the stock markets due to many security reasons, due to many confidential and many corporate reasons also. And finally, we have to understand some disadvantages. Now here disadvantages are actually very, very serious. Now there is a particular practice which is known as round tripping, right, which is actually very much strengthened due to this particular P note practice. Consider an Indian, right? Consider that he is actually a person who is living in India, right, and he is having a lot of black money. Right? He is having a lot of black money, and what he wants to do with the black money? He would want to invest maybe in the Indian stock markets, right? In the Indian stocks. And we have to understand he cannot easily invest black money directly in the stock markets, obviously, because to actually invest, you have to show a credible amount of income. Right? You have to show a transparent amount of income sources for whatever money you are investing. At the end of every financial year, the income tax department will be going through stocks, will be going through income also, and if they will be finding some discrepancy in this manner, so immediately your entire stocks and your entire, say, black money along with you will be in jail. Right? So that is why this person is a very clever individual. What he does, he contacts his US friend, right, who is actually say a SEBI registered stockbroker, or say for example an FPI, right? So this person is actually registered with SEBI for investing in the stock markets, and this person obviously is an FPI. Now this FPI and this person are best friends. So what he does, he is actually sending some of the black money to this investor, and he is actually buying some P notes on his behalf. So we find that this is actually one of the ways where round tripping can take place, where black money is actually invested in the Indian stock markets via P notes. Right? So this is actually a particular practice, right? One of the ways. It is not the only way where round tripping actually takes place. It's actually one of the ways in which black money turns into investment in the stock markets. So this is actually one form of disadvantage, because the names are actually anonymous, right? That is why this is a very serious kind of disadvantage in this manner. Now I want all of you here to please solve this question in the comment section and let me know what is the answer. Recently there has been an important appointment at the GST Appellate Tribunal, and it is very important for us to understand the structure of the GST Appellate Tribunal here. Firstly, we have to understand some very basics about what is GST and goods and services taxes. Now, goods and services taxes is actually an indirect tax. And when we talk about indirect tax, we mean that the burden of paying the tax do not fall directly on the consumer of various goods and services, right? For example, we can take the example of this pen. If we go to the market and buy this pen, maybe the pen is of say 15 rupees, and this 15 rupees is inclusive of GST. We have always heard about this kind of terms, right? So this is what we mean, that the tax has been already been say paid by you in the price of the commodity, right? It is inbuilt within the price, and here the burden of the tax is not directly on the consumer. The burden is actually directly on the manufacturers of the pen, right, who is actually filing the GST returns on your behalf. But obviously you are the person who is paying the tax, right? Now it is very different from the indirect tax, such as income tax, corporation tax, because we cannot actually transfer the burden of our income or corporate tax on the final consumers. But here, say the manufacturer of this pen, smartphone, tablets, right, or say books, they can actually transfer the burden of the taxes finally to the consumers. So this is why we have to understand GST is actually the goods and services tax, which is an indirect tax. In India, GST was introduced in the 101st Constitutional Amendment Act, and it was formally introduced in 2017. Before this, we had many amount of taxes which were levied by the center and the state government. Right now, the main target or the main aim of GST was to actually usher in a regime of one tax, one nation, right? So that is where we have to understand GST is actually streamlining all the center and the state taxes are subsumed, right? Many taxes levied by center and the state differently into CGST or the central GST, state GST, and finally the IGST or integrated GST, right? So we have all of the different form of taxes simplified in just 3 types of tax, right? And also when we talk about the slabs of taxes, we have effective around 4 slabs of taxes, plus there is an say 0% exemption slab also, right? Next, when we talk about the GST rates, right, we have say an exempt rate that is levied on the very essential items. Then we have 5% GST, we have 12% GST, we have 18% GST, and finally the 28% GST slabs. So based on the amount of say items, we have these many slabs. And also when we talk about say the implementation of the GST across the entire country, it is done by the Central Board of Indirect Taxes and Customs, right? So this is actually say a very brief overview what GST is. And when we talk about the GST Appellate Tribunal, so what happens is that this tribunal is under the Central Goods and Services Tax Act of 2017, right? And it is actually headed by the President of National Bench. And when we talk about the Appellate Tribunal, we have center and the state divisions, and in the center we have the National Bench, and the President will be from serving in this particular National Bench. Now the President will be say a former judge of Supreme Court or a former Chief Justice of High Court, right? So here the National Bench will be at Delhi, and there will be say technical members of both the center and the state at the national level. And when we talk about the Center Appellate Tribunal at various regional benches, here we have different members such as judicial members, two technical members from center and state each. Apart from the Center Appellate Tribunals of GST, we also have the State Appellate Tribunal, where we have similar the structure in the center also, the State Bench and the Area Bench, where in across this particular architecture of this hierarchy, we have the State President, who is a State Bench President here, and the 3 members, judicial member and the 2 technical members. So please do remember this hierarchy. This is very, very important for your prelims. And the tribunal is having this principal bench and the various state benches, as we have seen. Across all of the states, we have the various appellate tribunals at the states. And when we are talking about appellate tribunal, irrespective of any dispute that, say for example, a local MSME, a local shop registered with GST, they're having any issues with the GST authorities, they can move to the first appellate authority under GSAT, right? Then this appellate tribunal will be consulted. Here in this manner, well, the main appeal will be escalated to now the appellate tribunal. Even after, say, for example, at this level, the say particular litigants are not happy with the outcome of the tribunal, they can now enter the high courts and the Supreme Court here. This is actually the judicial phase here, where only the cases will be permitted where there is a substantial question of law, and only from the High Court and Supreme Court the cases will be proceeding when the High Court certifies that it is actually fit for an appeal to the Supreme Court. Right? So all of the cases will not be going. It is actually having some conditions in the judiciary, because we have to understand judiciary is already pending, plagued with too much of pending cases, and that is why this appellate architecture has been formed. And if not this, right, if the stakeholders are satisfied with this, then only they can move on to the higher levels here. Okay, now I have for all of you again another MCQ, the answer of which I definitely want in the comment section. Recently there has been talks of actually delisting Vietnam from US's list of non-market economy. So that is why we have to look at the market and non-economy status. Now, when we talk about market economy, we obviously mean that economic organization in our society, which is actually led by the market forces, right? Market forces of demand and supply. We understand that under demand and supply, the prices are based on the intersection of the demand and the supply curve. This is elemental, say, microeconomics, where we know this is the demand curve, which is a downward sloping demand curve. This is a supply curve, which is the upward sloping curve here. And at the intersection, we have the prices of various commodities. And also this is also something which we know as the market equilibrium. So it is actually highly efficient for any market or any society, any country to actually follow market practices, because it is here where the consumers are willing to buy various goods and services, and also the producer able to produce and also sell their produces at a particular price. So both the consumers and the producers, they are happy producing the same. So the countries, the economic system, right, the economic system in a particular countries which follow strictly the demand and supply forces of the market, these are known as a market economy. Right? And here we have to understand, when we talk about market economy, we have to understand there must be least amount of interference by government. Right? Now when we talk about government intervention, we obviously mean that sometimes the government will be interfering in the market to actually enable social justice. For example, say, enabling the distribution of the various goods and services to the people at free of cost. Now if the government is doing this at free of cost, then obviously this is hurting the market, but sometimes the government need to interfere in the same. So in market economy, a little bit of government interference is actually permitted to actually maintain the amount of social justice in the markets. But too much of government intervention, particularly in government-owned or state-owned businesses, are not favorable under the market economy. That means in market economy, the interference must be minimal in nature, right? And the state-owned enterprises, or say state-owned industries, factories, domestic manufacturing industries and so on, they must be minimal, because if the government starts owning and say giving, producing goods and services which the private sector are at, much more efficient at, right? So definitely that won't be a feature of market economy, right? Where the state-owned enterprises are low, because the government interference is also very low, right? So this is where we have to understand these are actually the main features of market economy, right? And we have to understand US, right, the United States, that designates a country as non-market economy on various factors, right? Now, there are various countries in the world which particularly do not follow the market economy status, or say the market economy practices. Well, sometimes the government can actually interfere in the markets to say play with the various say prices of the goods and commodities to manipulate the international trade. We have the famous example of China, right, who is actually say having a substantial amount of say private sector in the country, but despite that the government is time and again interfering in the various trade policies, in the various business policies of the domestic industries of China. And that is what the government is also altering the main core market principles. That is a very basic principle of economy, right? According to Adam Smith, who is actually the father of economy, right? He told that the markets must be left free of, say, government control as far as possible. That is also known famously as laissez-faire economy, right? Well, particularly laissez-faire economy or free market economy, that is not particularly possible because we need some amount of government intervention. So sometimes the market economy is also known as mixed market economy at times. But we have to understand that whenever there are some nations, whenever these kind of nations such as China and some other developing nations, they try to manipulate their prices, manipulate their policies, particularly even external policies like practicing excessive devaluation of their currency. So this is hurting the international trade. And particularly this hurts some developed nations, particularly their political and trade agendas such as China and US, right? That is why US has some classifications on the various factors on which they tell that there is particular some countries which are non-market countries and some which are market countries. So here the non-market countries, for this the US has various factors. First factor is that if the country's currency is convertible or not, that means the currency of almost all of the countries must be easily convertible into, say for example, say rupee to dollar or say to dollar to rupee. So this easy amount of convertibility is actually benefiting the world trade, right? It is actually not imposing any restrictions on this manner. So if a country has some restriction on the convertibility of a currency, that means that is not a market economy, right? That is not following the free and fair structure of the market economy. Then if the wage ranges are determined by free and bargaining between labor and management, then for example say there are say too much of labor union, political say communism kind of hold in this particular labor markets, this will be ultimately impacting the productivity of the companies. So that is what we have to understand. If there is too much of hold of the labor markets or of the labor over the particular producing markets, that is also not a market economy, right? Or say if particular joint ventures or other foreign investments are allowed or not, it actually looks into the openness of your economy. If your economy is open or closed, so that is also a factor. Whether the means of production are owned by the government, that is also, if say they are owned, that means they are not market economies. Then if the state controls the allocation of resources and price and output decision, that for example the case of China, where China, despite having many private companies, they also try to manipulate their production levels, right? And finally other factors like human rights are also considered. For example, say in developing countries it is very difficult to have proper amount of streamlined production with latest technologies, right? Because developed companies, for example like Vietnam and even India, the production in these kind of countries, they depend on whatever resources they have. Sometimes it has been seen at very say WTO meetings and at the international economic forums, it has been found that produce from these countries, developing nations, they were produced by child labor, or say they were produced by various other say unethical practices of say sex trafficking, human trafficking and so on. So these are the various human rights violation also. If these countries involved in, they also fall into this particular non-market economy status. Now according to US classification, we have countries like China, we have countries like Vietnam which are under the non-market economy status, right? And this is where Vietnam is having some issues, because the non-market economy status of Vietnam is actually hurting Vietnam's exports to the US. Now US is alleging that Vietnam is having a lot of amount of dumping in the US market. Now dumping is an economic practice which is done by particular nations to actually dump or supply huge amount of goods and services at very low prices in international markets. Say maybe the price of this particular pen is 100 rupees according to the market rate. Now what Vietnam does, Vietnam supplied this pen at only 50 rupees in the US. Now this is actually impacting the US pen makers, right? So this is actually the concept of dumping, where a particular country is alleged to actually supply very low price commodities below the market rate. Now US is alleging that Vietnam is involved in this dumping, and that is why US has imposed anti-dumping duty. Anti-dumping duty means that US now will be imposing 50 rupees extra duty on the Vietnam pens that is imported into the US to make the prices equal to both that of US and the imported pens, right? So this is where there is an allegation by Vietnam in this particular manner that US is not looking at the various margins in the particular markets, right? For example, we have to understand when US actually imposes this kind of anti-dumping duty to the various goods and services from the various parts of the world, it looks at similar kind of economic conditions. For example, US also looks at the price of this pen in Bangladesh, right, in India, in say other developing countries, for example, say even countries like Africa, right? So the price of this pen, US will be studying what is the same pen produced by local producers in Bangladesh, India and other parts of the world. And then only after evaluating all of the prices, they will be levying the anti-dumping duty. But according to Vietnam, Vietnam is arguing that this anti-dumping duty is not a very fair manner when it wants to say promote fair trade on the US side itself. If USA is actually trying to promote free and fair trade, the anti-dumping margins, right? The margins means the type of, say for example, the tax of the duty, or say the volume of duty or percentage of duty is actually very, very high. So that is what is actually impacting the Vietnam's imports into US, right? So these are the various things we have to consider here. And the Vietnam's case to get the market economy status, firstly, as we have already discussed, is the unfair, right, unfair imposition of high margin anti-dumping duty. Second reason is that Vietnam's economic reforms. As we can see across the various countries such as Vietnam, Indonesia and Thailand, over a period of time the GDP growth, particularly of Vietnam, is actually at very high at around 7%, right? And also when we talk about inflation, inflation is also moderate at around 4% across various Southeast Asian nations. We can say that Vietnam is actually a good in a good shape when it comes to the economic progress. So that is what we have to understand. Vietnam has told in various press releases that its non-market economy status is not valid anymore because it has taken various economic reforms. It has opened up the labor markets. It has opened up the labor markets. It has made the market wages more market friendly, right? That means it has reduced the amount of government intervention. That earlier in Vietnam, what used to be happen? Vietnam used to be a communism centric country, and the labor markets and the wage markets used to be heavily determined by the labor union protests, the labor union control over the particular state-owned enterprises. Now Vietnam has told that in addition to the reduction in the state-owned enterprises, we have taken this kind of reform. So how can you right now tell that Vietnam is having now non-market economy? We have taken many market economy steps, right? So this is where Vietnam is actually arguing for a more transparent mechanism by the US, right? And this is where we have to also talk about other kind of, say, a particular cases where Vietnam is actually talking about that Vietnam has also liberalized its currency to a lot extent. That means it has made its currency highly convertible in nature. That is, you can easily convert domestic Vietnam currency into dollars, into other Indian rupees and so on. So these are the various arguments that Vietnam is actually giving to actually persuade US to change its non-market status to market status economy. So that greater level of integration of Vietnam can happen with US, and also Vietnam's exports, they can be liberalized over a period of time, because this non-market economic status, while it is levied by the US, it is followed uniformly, right, blindly by the Western nations also, because whatever the US does, the West also follows, the rest of the West they also follows. So maybe these arguments will be helping Vietnam's case to get a market economy status in the future. Now I have for you all again another practice question. The answer of the same must be definitely given in the comment section. Recently, India saw a growth in its mineral production, and here we have to look into the data of the same. Now we find that the Indian Bureau of Mines recently released the index of mineral production of mining and quarrying sector. Now mining and quarrying sector is a very important sector which comes under the secondary sector, right, under the economic activities of the nation. We have primary sector, which is the agricultural sector and the allied activities. We have secondary sector, which is the industries, mining, quarrying and so on. And thirdly, we have the tertiary sector, which are the services sectors of the country. So mining is actually a particular sector within the secondary sector, okay? And as we can see here, right, when you can compare the February 2023 figures of mining to February 2024 figures of mining, that is in blue, right, almost in all of the mining related activities we see, particularly which refers to iron ore, limestone, chromite, gold, copper concentrate, bauxite, we see that we have seen impressive positive growth in this kind of minerals. And this is also very important because over a period of time, India's mineral security is one of the most important measures that India must be taken for the industrial development of the country. And for this index, the base year is 2011 and 12. When we talk about base year, we mean that this particular year is taken in comparison when we talk about the production of 2024, production of 2023, 22 and so on. That is, we have to compare from 2011-12 to this particular year. And there are many questions as to why 2011 and 12 is actually the base year in many of the Indian government's economic indexes. Because let me tell you, the base year of 2011 and 12, or say the year financial year 11 and 12 was actually very stable in nature. There were no major crises, there were no major economic crisis, there were no major military crisis, there were no much amount of inflation that was taking place, there was a decent amount of GDP growth. So we can tell that the country was kind of in a Goldilocks zone, right? When we talk about Goldilocks zone, that means it is just perfect, everything is going fine, right? That is what an economist's or say a policymaker's dream is, to actually function the economy in, right? So that is why 2011 and 12 is actually the base year of many, say, economic indexes. Now here, a very simple question, please do let me know in the comments. Recently, the IREDA got Navratna status, and this is a very positive news for PSU in the nation. And when we talk about Navratna status, Mini Ratna status and so on, so these kind of statuses are actually given to the central public sector enterprises, right, which are actually the status granted under the Ministry of Heavy Industries and Public Enterprises. Now under this ministry, a specific department of public enterprises, they are actually formally awarding or say classifying the various central public sector enterprises on the amount of their economic performance over a period of time. Now when we talk about the classification of PSUs, we have different classification of the PSUs in the country. Particularly we have to understand when the economic reforms took place in the 1991 economic reforms package, that is also famously known as liberalization, privatization and globalization, a majority of the focus came on the central public sector enterprises of the country. Because back then we have understood from say around 1970s, 80s and also in the early 1990s, we found that many of the central government companies, they were also known as sick companies. That means they were not performing good on economic parameters, profitability parameters. That is why one of the main parameters was privatization of the companies, privatization of the government companies. Now government actually over a period of time privatized a lot of government enterprises, but there are some enterprises which are still with the government, and the government has kept them for very strategic and also economic and various other imperatives of the country. And that is why from time to time this particular department classifies the PSUs based on their performances, right? Now when we talk about the classifications, we have to start with the first amount of classification, which we know as Mini Ratna status. Now Mini Ratna status is actually granted further in two categories, category 1 and Category 2. Category 1 Mini Ratna status is given to CPSEs, right, who have, say for example, in 1 to 3 years must be having profits, right? In even one of the year, they must be having net positive profits, and also their pre-tax profit, the Mini Ratna category status 1, they must be having a pre-tax profit of 30 crores, right? That is the pre-tax profit that they must be having. And also, when we understand the category 2 of Mini Ratna, is the main criteria for the same is that they must be making profit continuously for 3 years, right? Category 1, that means that in any one of the 1 to 3 years they can have profit, right? And also the pre-tax profit must be of 30 crores. And also in the category 2 status, the profits must be continuous, right? And also there are more kind of qualification in this, that Mini Ratna category 2, they must not default on any of their loans, right? They must not default in any one of the loans that they have taken, and also they must not be dependent on the government's budgetary resources. They must not be dependent on Government of India for any of the funding requirement or so on, right? Now government from time to time they can invest some money in there, but they must not be dependent. Their balance sheets must not be very weak. So this is how the performance of this particular Mini Ratna CPSE start. Now after, say a particular company has gotten a Mini Ratna status, they move on to getting a Navratna status. Now when we talk about the second Navratna status, it is about, say, companies who have already got Mini Ratna either category 1 or category 2 status, right? After that, they must be getting a minimum of 60 out of 100 scores in actually many of the corporate parameters. Parameters can be, say, a good amount of balance sheet, right, of the company. It can be about the market practices, about the various fiscal, right, practices which are undertaken by the company. It must be also having a decent amount of earnings per share of the company. These are actually very amount of corporate terms which are actually looking at healthy financial performance of the company. That means that firstly it should be already a Mini Ratna status 1 or 2 company, and finally it must be getting 60 out of 100 score, more than 60 out of 100 score in this particular parameters. The other parameters will be, say, cost of services and, say, including the net profit and various other parameters here, right? So this is your Navratna status, and after this finally we have a mega kind of a classification which is known as Maharatna. Maharatna status is actually given to companies who are actually having listing on the stock exchange. Now these companies must be listed at the stock exchange of the countries, and by listing we mean that these companies' shares must be trading at the individual stock exchanges, right? Their average turnover over the last 3 years must be 25,000 crores in the last 3 years, right? And also their average net worth must be 15. When we talk about net worth, they must be around 15,000 crores. So you understand these are extremely large companies, right? So this is what we have to understand, that these are the penultimate amount of PSUs. And finally, they can also have a global presence, right? So these are the very classification of the Mini Ratna, Navratna and Maharatna kind of PSUs. And here recently we see that IREDA, or Indian Renewable Energy Development Agency, which was actually conceptualized in 1987 and was conceptualized as a non-banking financial company, while it is also having registration under the Companies Act, right? It is actually providing the services of financing renewable energy projects in the country, supporting green power capacity, financing setting up of solar manufacturing units, a very, very important portion of the PLI scheme of the government of India, right? And also encouraging the use of renewable energy to foster sustainable growth in the country. So when we talk about IREDA, it is actually a government right now, a Navratna PSU, which has been recently granted the status, right? Because over a period of time, the government of India has actually focused on IREDA for majority of the solar missions in the country, be it the construction of the solar parks, be it the promotion of the rooftop solar projects. The government of India is actually looking at IREDA into actually spreading and also increasing the amount of their solar initiatives, and that is what IREDA is actually coming to play here. And when we talk about the benefits of IREDA getting Navratna status, firstly we have to understand that IREDA will be right now gaining operational and financial independence from the government of India. That means it has the independence right now to invest up to 1000 crores without the government of India's approval. So it can invest 1000 crores up to a cap limit of 1000 crores in, say, for example, single projects, right, which can be, say, 15% of, say, the entire cost, but the limit must be 1000 crore. Or say it can also invest up to 30% of its overall net worth of the company, right? But again, the cap is 1000 crore. So it can actually have this kind of operational and financial independence from the government of India in this manner, right? And finally, it will be also able to promote the global best practices, because obviously with the large amount of investments, with large amount of, say, participation from the government also, and also the influx of various government initiatives, the company can invest in greater new technologies, new human resources, skilling imperatives, and so on. So this is what is actually the benefit of the Navratna status. And here I want all of you to again practice this question and let me know the answer in the comments below. Recently there has been instances of rising in cocoa prices. Now this cocoa prices is a very, very important aspect for your Indian economy, because it is a key ingredient in making chocolates. And you know, the distribution of cocoa plantation across the world can be found in this map, where Latin America is constituting around 17%, while Africa is leading 72% of the production. It is actually led by countries such as Ghana and Ivory Coast, right? So we find that Africa is the continent which is producing the most amount of cocoa beans in the entire world. Now recently we have seen reports of rising cocoa prices. Now here, when we talk about cocoa plantation, in the entire world, it is the continent of Africa which is producing 72% of the cocoa beans, right? And it is actually followed by Latin American nations, and finally Asia and Oceania, right, where we have nations like India and also the Southeast Asian nations who produce cocoa. And here it is according to the 2015 data. Now when we talk about the individual nations, we find Ivory Coast is the largest cocoa producer. It is followed by Ghana, then Indonesia, Ecuador, Cameroon, and the rest of the world. When we talk about our own India, we found that in India, the largest amount of cocoa beans are produced in Andhra Pradesh, Kerala, Karnataka, and Tamil Nadu. Now, for your prelims examination, it is very, very important to note this particular amount of trends. Now, we have to understand that recently, the prices of cocoa have risen sharply. Right, as we have seen over the last 2-3 years only, the prices have increased substantially over a period of time, where the prices were stable at around, say, $3,000 per ton of cocoa beans. Right now it has skyrocketed to around $10,000. Now this is not a joke that is happening here. Now, according to recent reports, we find that the prices of cocoa, which was, say, stable from 2021 onwards at around $3,000 to $2,000 level. Right now it is at around $10,000 per ton. So this is actually a very serious case, and the main factors that is causing the rise of price of cocoa is actually the climatic events taking place in Ivory Coast, right, and Ghana, particularly due to the local conditions, due to heavy rainfall and the climatic conditions of droughts which is happening in the African nations and also all of the world. This is actually attributed to this particular reason, that in the most producing countries there are reasons such as excessive rainfall. Second, we have this issue of El Nino in the last financial year, right, where we saw, right, increased amount of rainfall in the major producing countries such as Africa and Latin America, which has destroyed the cocoa crops, right. This is actually one of the reasons why Ivory Coast and Ghana's production levels have decreased over a period of time, right. And finally, there is this another reason which is known as black pod disease. Black pod disease is actually a kind of a fungal and bacterial disease which infect the seeds of cocoa beans, and that is what also impacted this kind of say price rise. And when we talk about an international organization which is known as International Cocoa Organizations, right, it is an intergovernment organization which was established in 1974, right, and it was actually established under UN, and it led to the successive international cocoa agreements also. And here it is located at Abidjan in Ivory Coast, right. It is not located in any developed nation. And also you have to understand that the first international cocoa agreement was negotiated in Geneva at the United Nations International Cocoa Conference. And also when we talk about the members, there are 51 members countries, and 22 are cocoa exporting nations, and 29 are actually cocoa importing nations. And these together represent 86% of the entire cocoa exports and the entire market here. And all the members are represented in the International Cocoa Council, the highest governing council of the ICCO. And it's to be noted that India is not a member of ICCO here. Now, again a question on ICCO. I want all of your answers in the comment section below. Now, recently there has been a disease known as foot rot disease or Bacani disease, which is spreading across the basmati rice roots. As you can see here, the roots here have kind of blackened, and this is because it is kind of rotting away. Now, this is a fungal disease which takes place and in various crops, particularly right now it is taking place in Punjab's basmati rice, which is actually leading to the destruction of basmati rice across the various fields. And we find that it starts firstly with seeds or say grains which are infected. And we know that whenever we try to cultivate rice, firstly we try to have nurseries of the rice. That means we try to have some samplings of the rice cultivation crops, and we try to grow them inside a particular shade, right? And then finally we transfer the nurseries to the finally crop lands or say the fields, farmlands, right? Now, these diseases generally take place in the nurseries when the grains or say the seedlings are infected due to this fungal agent. Now, this is a particular fungal disease where this fungus spread across these grains, and finally this, whenever this kind of grains they are planted on the crops or say on the lands, they start spreading and they start infecting the other plants also. And the most typical and the most important phase of the spread of the disease is the flowering stage, where it's this particular growth of the crops and also the height of the crops are restricted due to this particular disease. So here for this, the Punjab Agricultural University, they come up with a very important non-chemical alternative to solve the issue of this disease, right? This is known as Trichoderma aspergillum, right? So this is actually a kind of a non-chemical alternative because it has been found out that the main cause of this foot rot disease in the basmati rice is due to the use of various pesticides right, or say and also the insecticides in particular to say the promotion of this basmati rice. And here, this is all that you want to know in this kind of article, and I want all of you to please solve this question in the comments now. Recently, the government of India has released warnings regarding a very interesting event that takes place in the markets, which is known as drip pricing. Now, drip pricing is very familiar to all of us. Say, remember that day when you were browsing through various shoes on Flipkart or Amazon, right? And when you went to the order page, you saw all of a sudden many charges, right? For example, say the main MRP of the shoes. Then we had handling charges, shipping charges, donation for a cause, platform fee, rain fee, this and that. So we understand whenever we go to any markets, we depend on the MRP or maximum retail price, right? So whatever the MRP should be, we should be paying that price. But what happens in across all online platforms, they add a bundle of various other kind of charges and they take the prices much above the MSP, right? And this leads to the say increasing amount of costs for the consumers at the end of the day, because obviously all of the online platforms, they follow this kind of pattern only. And if you want to buy something, definitely you have to now buy it through online medium. And if you want to purchase some items, you have to purchase through offline medium right now, because online platforms are having this amount of nefarious practices. And that is why the government right now, via the Department of Consumer Affairs, it has warned that the very e-commerce platforms and the various platforms, they must not be using this drip practice, right? Where these consumers must be made aware of what happens actually, because finally the cost of the prices, of cost of the goods and services, they increase after the imposition of these prices. Now we have a question for all of you. Please do solve it and let me know in the comment section what is the answer for this. Recently, in the month of May, the stock markets have seen a high amount of volatility, and this is reflected in India Volatility Index. And when we talk about volatility, we have to introduce you to a concept of the stock markets. Look at this particular stock market chart. Now this is the black line that we see here. This is what we know as the volatility index. That means we understand that in stock markets, the sentiments of the stock brokers, the various investors are very important, because even if they get some hint of any instability in economic condition, any war or any crisis that is happening, the stock markets get panicked. The fear in the stock markets are a very dangerous kind of a thing, because once the stock market panics, the entire market, or say entire financial system, entire economic system, they can collapse. And that is why to measure that panic, to measure their fear, we have to understand the index. Look at this particular black diagram here, black line here. We find that from 2000 onwards, the world had seen many crises. For example, the dot-com bubble or the internet bubble of say early 2000s, the September 11 or say the 9/11 attacks, right? The Iraq wars, the global financial crisis of 2008, the European debt crisis of 2010, the Arab Spring incidents, which were very popular in the 2011 period, right? We have the emergence of ISIS, and also the Syrian refugee crisis following after ISIS crisis. Then we have the trade wars which were taking place between US and China. After that, we also saw, right, the COVID pandemic in 2020, right, and also the emergence of various second and third waves of the COVID pandemic, such as the Delta and Omicron variant. And even if we talk recently as of now, right, we also had Russia and Ukraine crisis, the Israel-Hamas attacks, and so on. So we find that whenever there has been any important or major global crisis, cannot we see a spike in these charts, right? We are seeing the spikes in this chart, particularly see in this COVID crisis. The spike is very high. That means in this particular spikes or these periods, the markets were extremely volatile. The stock markets were extremely volatile. That means people were actually selling off their stocks. The stock prices were fluctuating by anything, right? So this is actually reflecting the chaos, the fear in the stock market. So higher the spikes will be, the higher will be the volatility of the markets. Now this volatility index for the very first time in the world was actually formed by Chicago Board of Options Exchange, right? It formed it in 1993 on the basis of S&P 100 or Standard & Poor 100 index. That is, we just have the Nifty 50 in India, right? Sensex. So this is actually the stock market indexes followed in the US, right? So it is actually measuring the volatility index in this particular manner for the first period of time, and we have seen these are the various spikes in the global events and also in the stock markets. Now when we talk about India's keys, right, we see that in 2020 we have seen this high spike because we had COVID-19 during this particular period of time, right? And also when we talk about recent spikes, we also have seen the recent Adani Hindenburg case, which was also taking place during this period of time. That is also, we saw huge spikes in the market. And also as of now, as we can see, as we can zoom here in this particular figure, we are seeing a little amount of spike in this manner. Why? Because in 2024, we saw the Lok Sabha elections, and due to Lok Sabha elections, the outcome or the anticipation of the outcomes of the results or the election results were very much a cause for panic among the investors in India. So based on who the party will be, who will be the actually main government forming at the center. So based on that, the stock markets have been kind of volatile in the recent days, particularly right now on June 4. Right, we had seen huge amount of crashes of various stocks by at least 10 to 15% of their values. Why? Because we have seen, say in the first time in the last 10-12 years, a chance of an incidence for the first time in around 10 years where the party at the center has kind of seen its seats get reduced from the earlier election results. So that is what actually led to this high amount of volatility in the recent times, and this volatility started from the month of May and even persisted till June beginning. Now again we find that this is a question where we have to understand that about the India VIX. Now India VIX, we have to understand, in India it is actually calculated by the National Stock Exchange, right? And it is actually based on the Nifty options. And here we have to understand that based on this, please do let me know what is the answer for the question here.